All right, here we go on to Objective 8. And so here we have this little funny thing. I don't remember what year the Cold War was, but I know it was in the winter. Uh, Hopefully that will not be you. The Cold War starts in 1945 and will go all the way until 1991. So it lasts a very long time. All right. Now, Objective 1 is we need to know what is a Cold War or Stalin's summer vacation, and how it differentiates from a conventional war or traditional war, and then also a proxy war. So, a conventional war uses traditional weapons and tactics. They have well defined sides, usually by colors or uniforms. The Cold War is political hostility between countries that uses threats, propaganda, and open warfare. Um, we never physically fought the Russians, which is why SpongeBob's there. How did the Russians win the Cold War? Imagination. Because they didn't, okay? Now, a proxy war is a war instigated by a major power that does not involve, or that does not itself become involved. So, um, when we fought in Korea and Vietnam, those are proxy wars, if you will. Now, Objective 8.2 areas of conflict during the Cold War. Are you guys rushing to end the Cold War? No, we're just stalling. I do have my Russian thing, my Russian voice, right? And ooh, Cold War. No, we're just Stalin. Silly Americans. I don't know. That's my Russian for you. Now, Eastern Europe, Stalin. And so right here we have the Potsdam Conference, which was World War II, divided Germany into four sections, and then will become two. The East is communist and the West is democratic. What makes it even worse is that Berlin is actually divided as well, which is inside of the communist. Now we also have the Eastern Bloc, which is a collection of countries that border the Soviet Union taken for protection. Stalin is very fearful of somebody like Hitler coming and taking the Soviet Union again. Now, Stalin and other people, Stalin in particular, uh, lives in a cult of personality, and this is when the idea gets bigger. Um, the person gets bigger than the idea they promote, and almost become like a god. And so you can see here, Stalin towering over the people, etc. Also, great '80s, maybe not. It was '80s. Rock song by an all-black rock group. It's called Cult of Personality, and they were called Living Color. Um, Look it up; it's a good one. Now, Eastern Europe, after Stalin, we get Khrushchev. Now, Nikita Khrushchev um, is going to promote something called de-Stalinization to remove Stalin's history and return communism to its purest form, which would be under Lenin. There are two revolutions in 1956 in Poland. Gomulka was the guy. He had a thaw give Poland their own brand of communism, and they give it to him. Now, a few months later, Emir Nagri uh, wants to basically leave communism, and there's a violent put down of the protest. And so right here you can see this is Nikita Khrushchev. Politicians, let's do a Russian for you here. Politicians are all the same all over. They promise to build a bridge, even where there is no river. Like that. That was pretty good Russian. Now, Korea. We now move to Korea. Korea is the 1950s. There's a civil war between the communist North and the democratic South, divided at the 38th parallel. The leaders in North Korea, Kim Il sung, and in the South Korea, Syngman Rhee. Um, U.S. supports the South, the Soviet Union supports the North. It's divided at the 38th parallel to prevent war. There's another whole thing about Korea, and we'll get there in a minute. Now, China is also a thing there. There's a civil war for 20 years. It ends in 1950. The nationalist leader, whom the United States supported, Chiang Kai shek, is defeated. He will flee to Hong Kong and set up a second government of China. We'll get there. The communist leader Mao Zedong assumes control of what is now Red China. The U.S. will support Hong Kong and the nationalist government, while the Soviet Union supports China until Mao wants complete control and will actually break away. And so here you can see this is Mao Zedong. I shall show you the light at the end of the tunnel, and at the same time kill around 30 million people. Mao Zedong, in some circles, has actually been estimated to have a higher kill total somewhere to 40 to 50. And so we'll look at that. Our next place is Cuba. Now, if you remember, Cuba had been a protector of the United States. We had the right to intervene. The U.S. is backed a military government by a military dictator by the name of Fulgencio Batista, whom the people hated. There is a coup led by communist supporters, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And so here's Che Guevara here. Spent the whole life fighting capitalism, and he died on Black Friday. And that is true. He died on Black Friday. Anyway, now Fidel Castro and Che Guevara are socialists at this point, but they do not announce that until after the Bay of Pigs, when the United States will try to intervene. Cuba becomes communist and takes over U.S. business interest, and there's going to be some problems with that. Now, objective 8.3 is the spread of communism and how it actually spreads. And so for here, I put a Dr. Seuss book, The Great Butter Battle. Great book where they talk about which side of the toast do you butter, and it's about the Cold War, guys. It just basically saying which government is right or wrong depends on who you're asking, because in the end, it all kind of looks the same. Now, at the Yalta Conference, we have Stalin, and here he is, right? There's no time for Stalin when you're rushing to industrialize. That's getting funnier. Anyway, now at Yalta, the debate over how to rule the former Nazi empire. Stalin wants communism, FDR wants democratic elections, and a compromise is made. Okay? The big three, of which were England, Soviet Union, and the United States. Now, I put the people out there because at first it's Churchill, Stalin, FDR, but Churchill's voted out by Clement Attlee. Stalin will stay, and FDR will pass away, and we get Truman. Now, Stalin will go in there, and he will communize these countries because of how close they are to the Soviet Union. And that poses a big problem to somebody who's just been promised that, hey, you said they're going to give them democratic elections, and you just basically pulled a Hitler. Now, communism, how is it different from socialism? At first, communism is essentially the same thing as socialism. Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto. Worst book ever. Anyway, and in this, the state or the government owns everything and produces everything. There's no economic system or religion. Workers are basically given money or food based on needs. There's no private property or incentive to work harder. You simply work to survive. Now you can see here Stalin had a way of dealing with people. It was called the Gulag. Famously, he actually sent his own son to the Gulag. Now, whether he sent someone for making him laugh or not, I don't know. But there it is. It's basically a forced labor camp out in Siberia. Now, objective 8.4. Okay, so communism is going to spread. How do we stop it? And so here we have, Patrick, what if we took the spread of communism and pushed it somewhere else using a policy of containment? And so we're going to basically see how we get to this point. All right? Now, I always tell you, Truman was contained to the bathroom because of greasy turkey. All right? So how did Truman come up with containment? Because of what was happening in Greece and Turkey. All right? So the Truman Doctrine, someone basically comes up and says, hey, Truman, Stalin is going to get involved in Greece and Turkey. There are civil wars there. What are you going to do? Truman goes and asks Congress for money to support Greece and Turkey so they won't fall to communism. And it works. Okay? Later on, this policy will become known as containment. It's based on the long telegram. The idea is not to get rid of communism, but rather to stop the spread of it however possible. Because in the end, they are human beings. And so I liken this in the case of a little puppy. You go get a cute little puppy, and it's there, but the puppy starts peeing and pooping everywhere in your house. Now, you can't kill the puppy. That's wrong. You want to train the puppy that, hey, peeing and pooping inside of this house is not right. In other words, spreading communism is not right. So what do? You will contain it so that you can teach it. You maybe put it behind a pen or in a kennel until ultimately it realizes that, hey, you have to go pee and poop. Okay? I just reduced Joseph Stalin to a puppy peeing on your carpet. You're welcome. Now, after the success of the Truman Doctrine, The Marshall Plan. Secretary of State George Marshall says, okay, I want billions of dollars to rebuild Europe so it won't fall to communism. And so here it is. This is the Marshall Plan on the right. Whatever the weather, we will reach welfare together. And you can see all the countries of the flag there. And so starting from United States there, little tail of the United States, but you've got Sweden, and you've got Turkey, and you've got Greece, and you've got France, Italy, or not Italy, United Kingdom, England, Portugal, Denmark, Belgium, West Germany. What's the other one there? Another Scandinavian country. Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Martinique, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot. Now, objective 8.5. Eisenhower's policy. Now, Eisenhower comes in, and I can't get no da-na-na. I can't get no da-na-na. Satisfaction. No. Rolling Stones? It's a good one. So I can't. That's a great pun. I found that. Made me laugh entirely too much. Now, the new containment. All right. John Foster Dulles is brought in to create brinkmanship. And brinkmanship, you can see, you and I go hard at each other like we're going to war. It's going to the edge of war without the intention of actually fighting to prevent a war. And I know that's crazy, but that's what it is, okay? Also, we introduce massive retaliation to prevent or deter the Soviet Union invading countries by threatening nuclear war. In other words, you set one foot in Cuba, and we're going to bomb you until you can't see straight. That's the equivalent of you walking down the hallway and you're in a bad mood or whatever. Somebody flicks your ear and you pick up a desk and hit him in the face. It doesn't equal. Now, this gives the Soviet Union no option but to basically build up their nuclear arsenals, and we are now left with something called MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction, where both sides have a nuclear bomb, and to deter a nuclear attack, they threaten a nuclear attack. It's crazy. And now the Eisenhower Doctrine is to expand the Truman Doctrine to include the Middle East. So now we move from Europe into the Middle East. Truman was concerned in particular about Egypt, a few other places there, Syria. There you go. Now, objective 8.6. The Cold War is essentially a chess game, if you will. And so here we have Stalin, we have Truman, and you're countering, right? You don't want to actually kill the other side. In the end, you just want the other side to say, hey, you're better than me. Good job. So we have the Iron Curtain, okay? So here we have the way to Russia. We have going on here. We have Churchill under the wall of this. And so to counter the communization of Eastern Europe, Winston Churchill comes to the United States and gives the Iron Curtain speech. This was to make the U.S. aware of the communist threat to democracy in Europe. Okay? The first real crisis we have is in Berlin. Remember, Berlin is inside of communist East Germany, and so many of the people from Eastern Berlin are migrating to West Berlin. The Soviet Union decides we're going to starve out West Berlin by having a blockade. And so basically they won't let rail lines in, etc. Now, if we roll through this blockade, war will start. So the U.S. responds with the Berlin airlift. We're going to drop supplies into West Berlin without provoking an attack. Very cool story here you have there, the story of Berlin's chocolate pilot, the Candy Bomber, who thought about kids. A really, really interesting story. You can go look that up. And in 1960, it still happened, and so East Berlin will build the infamous Berlin Wall, which will stand for 1960 to 1989, 29 years before it comes down. Now, the alliances begin to start up just like we have in other wars. Right after the success and kind of failure at the same time of the Marshall Plan, where we can't continue to pay this money, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is formed, and this is done collective security. It's all the countries here in blue, also including Canada and the United States, to prevent countries from the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union's fine with this until in 1955. They will add West Germany. At this point, 1955, the Warsaw Pact is an alliance of communist countries to prevent democratic involvement. They're all the ones in red. And so what we basically have here is divided. Now the ones in gray are neutral. They are. Now, Objective 8.7, functions and groups of the United Nations. And so you can see United in quotations there. Now, the function of the United Nations. The United Nations formed after World War II, split amongst the two superpowers, U.S. and the Soviet Union. The functions are to maintain international peace and security and to investigate any dispute that could threaten this idea. And so here we have Kim Il-jung. Dear United Nations, you treat me like a criminal and it feels so rough. Now, the UN groups, we have the General Assembly, main decision-making body in the UN. All countries have an equal say in the decision-making process. And then you have the Security Council, a permanent group of 15 countries in charge of maintaining the peace. The vote must be unanimous. The key big thing there, because Soviet Union is actually boycotting when Korea happens. Otherwise, Korea doesn't happen. Now, Objective 8.8, the U.S. reaction to Communist Revolution in China. So you see this person here. When you kickstart the Communist Revolution in China, and Mao get all the credit. Kung Fu Panda stuff. Now, the UN decision. So, once China becomes communist, the UN Security Council meets. The Soviet Union is boycotting. The UN agrees on a U.S.-led police attack action to get North Korea back across the 38th parallel. General Douglas MacArthur is put in charge of Korea. It's called a police action. Now, MacArthur wants to nuke China because of the involvement in Korea. And Truman will be fired. Truman will fire MacArthur for insubordination. Truman believed in the concept of a limited war, containment, whereas MacArthur, a military man, wants to wipe them completely out. And so somebody here made this little meme. When I said nuke the Chinese, I meant to put the takeout in the microwave. Because nuking the China doesn't seem like a good idea. Now, 8.9 is the Korean War and its impact on the Cold War. And so here you see Kevin Hart. What do you mean we didn't win the Korean War? Well, we didn't. It's a tie, and it could start at any time is the scary part. So the Korean War starts in 1950. The North Koreans will invade the South to unify it as one country. The UN responds with police action we talked about. MacArthur goes beyond the 38th parallel. The Chinese enter the war, and it ends in a stalemate. Now, for TV history in the United States, MASH is a show set around the Korean War, and really iconic. And if you ever actually go to California, the park where they shot a lot of the outside scenes, they left some of the stuff there, and you can go and walk around it. Kind of cool. So the end, some cool things here. First is the Chosin Few. Some U.S. troops are stuck in a place called the Chosin Reservoir, where the temperature is well below freezing. Call for Tootsie Rolls, which was a code word for ammunition, and they got literal Tootsie Rolls and ended up saving them. The peace talks begin after the armistice is signed. However, no peace treaty has ever been made. What they did decide to do is what you see here on the right. Everything there and behind that yellow line, and the yellow line on the other side stretches across the whole peninsula, and it's called the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone. It's established around the actual 38th parallel. If you go behind that man there and you see where the smooth concrete changes, that's the actual thing. Now, they will build these blue peace buildings called Panmunjom. The two countries can cooperate today. There was some delegation, some talk, but it didn't ultimately work out. And a few years ago, President Trump actually went and visited President of North Korea, and things seem to be headed in a good direction, but nothing really has changed since then. Now, Objective 8.10 is the Cold War at home. And so here you have the South Park. That's right, Duck and Cover. And Duck and Cover video is so awesome. We'll get into that. So effects on the family. If you went to school, children were taught to duck and cover like Bert the Turtle. I'll show you that video. Fallout shelters were built in most new homes or in backyards. And it begins to take a psychological toll on the mind, where all you begin to see are, is that an actual plane or a Russian? And so things were there. And to an extent, if you've seen Stranger Things Season 3, that still is playing a role there in the films that are referenced, whether it be Red Dawn and the fear of the Russians actually building this thing underneath us. Now, the effects on the workers in politics. Congress will pass the Smith Act. All Communist Party members must register, and they could be blacklisted. Congress will also pass the Taft-Hartley Act, which you can see they call the slave labor law, and it was trying to discourage unions. Now, what's the big deal with unions? They came out of socialism. It's the idea of all for one for all, that type of mentality. And some states could actually require open shops where workers are not required to join a union. They can if they want, but it's not a necessity. Now, the Red Scare 2.0. So we have a second Red Scare, much like after World War II. And this one is very, very big, and we have some popular icons. Captain America was actually created and fights Red Skull, which is America fighting communism. So great there. We have the Loyalty Oath Program in the 40s, where government workers and teachers must pledge loyalty. And in the 40s, going into the 50s, we have the HUAC, or the car right there running over people's toes, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they're searching for any communist. However, they were running over people's toes, or rights, if you will, in this pursuit, and saying it's okay, we're hunting communists. Now, all of this frenzy reaches a new level in the 1950s with McCarthyism. Okay? Now, Joseph McCarthy is a demagogue. He is a political person that appeals to people's desires rather than using rational reason. In other words, if people were afraid of communist, he was going to produce communist, even if that wasn't necessarily what was happening. So McCarthyism now is considered accusing someone of doing something with little or no evidence, just producing a name and saying they're a communist. Now, victims were actually blacklisted. One of the most famous group were actors, and they were called the Hollywood 10. Now, along these same lines, Arthur Miller, who was a playwright and book writer, actually wrote The Crucible. He actually was rejected for something, went home, wrote The Crucible, because it's not historically accurate. He uses the judge of the Salem witch trials to basically force a parallel to McCarthyism of the 1950s. I can't say much more than that because you're going to read that in English class and English teachers might kill me. But just understand that the whole reason he wrote The Crucible was not to talk about the Salem witch trials, but rather to talk about McCarthyism and what was happening in society in kind of a different manner. In other words, we didn't learn from mistakes from the past. Now, the ups and downs of McCarthyism, okay? So first, the ups. We have the Chambers Hiss affair. Journalist Whittaker Chambers accuses former FBI agent Alger Hiss of being communist. His proof is pumpkin papers. And yes, he went out to this field, found a pumpkin, it had been hollowed out, and he pulled these papers out of it. It was a whole big deal. Hiss does not go to jail for being a communist. He does go for perjury, however. We have the Rosenbergs, husband and wife team, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and they are actually executed or in the same way as Sacco and Vanzetti for being atomic spies. Now, unlike Sacco and Vanzetti, who we don't know if were guilty or not, in the 1980s, we did actually find out that the Rosenbergs were, in fact, guilty and were spies. Doesn't excuse it, but there you are. Okay? Now, the down. Army McCarthy hearings. Now, this is going to end McCarthyism because it was televised. He basically accused the Army of breeding communism. So people got to see Joseph McCarthy and all of his badgering and bullying and getting things out. Famously, he was told, "You have no sense of decency." And so at this point, they will censure him, which means everything he said was not true. And he more or less goes into a drinking binge. Will ultimately probably drink himself to death. Some have said that he died of liver failure. So there you are. Now, last objective. I know there's a lot here. Objective 8.11 is events and effects of the space race. And so you can see here the Sputnik satellite lapping the U.S. thing, and the guy laid back, and it says U.S. complacency, which means being happy in your state in life and not trying to proceed. So, some Soviet victories in the space race. The first artificial satellite is Russian, Sputnik 1. The first animal in space is a dog, and it's Lanka. It's the dog there. Now, unfortunately, for the puppy, there was no plan for re-entry, and the puppy actually died. And the first human in space is Yuri Gagarin. So if we're looking at this, we're not doing too hot. Now the major fear is we start to ban nuclear testing, and people thought, well, let's get to the moon. We can test on the moon, that type of mentality. So there's a race essentially to get the moon, and we're behind at this point. Okay. So how do we catch up? Well, as we're doing this, we had these things called these U-2 spy planes, and the Soviets had spies as well. A U-2 spy plane is shot down in Russia, and the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, is captured and interrogated. He didn't take his cyanide pill like he was supposed to and basically commit suicide. However, he did not tell anything, and he was later released. This event was massive because the Soviets were so upset. Khrushchev actually took off his shoe at the UN, was banging it. And it's not the fact that we spied, it's the fact that he thought we were better than this, and how could we stoop to their level? It's kind of an interesting idea how that works. So Eisenhower comes up, they look at it, and they say, you know who's to blame? Education. So Eisenhower is going to start NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Congress is going to pass the National Defensive Education Act, NDEA, in which they're going to stress science, math, and foreign language. If you ever wondered why you need 2 layers of foreign language to go to a college, this is it. We're also going to start the Apollo missions with the intention of actually getting to the moon.